Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I want to start with the title of today's session because it's intentionally a little provocative. Stop reviewing the wrong clients. Most financial institutions aren't struggling because their teams aren't doing enough risk reviews. In many cases, they are doing an enormous amount of it. The question is whether that effort is actually being directed toward the originators that represent the greatest risk. So today, we're going to look at ACH exposure limits through a slightly different lens, not simply do we have limits, but are those limits actually helping us focus our attention in the right place? And we're going to make this very tangible. We look at the rules, we look at an actual portfolio, and we'll show what changed when risk and utilization were considered together. I'm Markus Holzmüller, Chief Revenue Officer at Affirmative, and I'll be your moderator today. And I'm fortunate to be joined by three people who can look at this question from very different perspectives. Amy Morris is the Senior Director of ACH Network Rules at Nacha. Amy is going to help us separate what the rules actually require from some of the practices that institutions may simply have inherited over time. Next, Scott Brown, our Chief Information Officer at Affirmative. Scott brings a really interesting combination of technology, risk, and operational experience to that discussion. Scott served as a Marine and was involved in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I think that background is relevant here because a lot of what we are going to talk about today is ultimately about using information to identify where the real risk is and focusing your resources accordingly. And last but not least, we have James, our CEO. And there's one part of James's background that is particularly relevant for today's discussion. James is a statistician. For those who don't know what a statistician is, if James were starting his career today, we would probably call him a data scientist or maybe even a decision scientist, which sounds much cooler. So James, apologies for aging you in front of everybody today. But it actually matters for today's discussion because we are going to spend a lot of time talking about how you can take large amounts of historical transaction data and turn that into better, more defensible decisions, which is very much in James's wheelhouse. Let's get started. I'll keep us moving, occasionally interrupt everybody with questions, and we leave time at the end for your questions. So before we go into the details, I want to set expectations for what we hope you will take away from today. We really want to answer three questions. First, are you spending your review time on the right clients? Most institutions already have processes for monitoring ACH exposure and reviewing exceptions. The question is whether those processes are actually directing attention toward the originators that represent the greatest risk or simply toward the ones that happen to hit a static limit. Second, can you reduce risk and improve the client experience at the same time? Those two objectives are often treated as if they are in conflict. We tend to think that tighter risk controls automatically mean more friction for customers. What we are going to show today is that if limits are better aligned with actual behavior and risk, you can potentially do both. Reduce unnecessary exposure on one side while giving strong, low-risk clients more room to operate on the other. And then third, what should modern limit management actually look like? We'll talk about the data, the methodology, the controls, and ultimately what you should be looking for in technology, whether you build something internally, use a third-party solution, or simply want to improve the process you have today. So this isn't really a conversation about having more controls. It's about making the controls you already have more intelligent and more targeted. Before I hand it over to our speakers, I'm curious, how confident are you that your originator limit time is landing on your riskiest originators? Confident, we target it deliberately, somewhat, it's partly by design, not confident, or we have no way to tell. Please take a few seconds to answer this question. I think this was enough time, Elizabeth. Now over to our speakers. I'm curious to hear what you think about the results. James, I actually want to start with you here because you've spent a lot of your career looking at risk through a data and decision-making lens. What do you think about the data?
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like there's a fair amount of confidence that the over limit reviews are appropriately focused on clients. I think that actually would be, in my view, a little bit inconsistent with some of the data that we've seen across our clients that we're gonna go through in this conversation today. So maybe we'll help illuminate some opportunities.
And it still looks like 32%, 23 plus 9, don't really know, right? Like a third of our participants probably should listen to very carefully today.
Yeah. Now,
Okay.
sure. So I'd love to talk a bit about the problem if I could. First, I want to thank you, Marcus, for emceeing today's event. You have a much more logical and methodical style as you lead us through this than I do, and I think that's fantastic and a great improvement over me hamming it up typically. So thank you for providing us with some structure and some discipline. I do want to talk about just, I guess, for a couple minutes, the nature of the problem, at least as we see it at Affirmative. First, I want to say that one of the ways we think about our mission is that we're here to support our clients with data-driven solutions to meaningful business problems. When we bring a client into the Affirmative family, it's our job to continue to not just provide them the platform and the reporting and the analytics that they sign up for, but as a part of our commitment to them is to continue to reinvest in our data, our people, and our tools. And one of the ways we think about how to prioritize that investment is really looking for some of the most meaningful problems that we can solve. And in this case, uh, and of course, you can also look at a problem as an opportunity. In this case, we believe that there's an opportunity to do three things at once that sometimes seem um, inconsistent or competitive with one another, or mutually exclusive. One, there's an opportunity to reduce the bank's exposure by reducing unused uh, lines. At the same time, improving the efficiency of the operations of the bank and focusing time spent on setting and managing limits as well as doing over limit reviews. And then the third one, which sometimes people might think is inconsistent with those first two, is that this is also an opportunity to dramatically improve client satisfaction. Clients today business clients want to have access to their funds. They want to have liquidity. They get frustrated when their financial institutions uh, needlessly and unnecessarily restrict their access to submit transactions. And this is an opportunity to combine all those three factors together to really produce a positive result for the financial institution. Um, Now, focusing on limits, I mentioned our job is to provide or come up with data-driven solutions to key business problems. This is the most recent, but by no means is it the first. We've been working over the last few years, and we've had some prior webinars about our originator risk scoring, and that was an effort that we undertook over many years and much research and development, based on our clients telling us that they really don't have an objective, data-driven way to quantify the risk of their originators or their business clients. And they would need to be able to manage that risk because, of course, they need to do annual reviews, and they need to be able to manage limits and other decisions that they make in the financial institution. And so, in response to that gap, we developed our affirmative risk grade, which is available through our platform. This is the next logical step of applying that risk grade because there's this gap within banks today, is based on what our clients have told us, that their efforts to set limits could be vastly improved for a few reasons. One, limits are typically static. They're set when the client comes into the bank, and they tend not to change. They're not proactively managed. So clients that come into the bank that grow over time usually hit these caps, start hitting these caps, and sometimes it's a hard stop, and that takes their time and it restricts their ability to get funds. Um, the reviews for over limit approval, particularly based on like a hard stop, those reviews are generally like the same for every client, regardless of their risk. They're time consuming. And again, all of this means that the business client for the financial institution is significantly inconvenienced. Now banks generate between a third and two-thirds of their overall revenue from their business clients. Our clients tend to have more of a focus on business clientele, which is why they need a good treasury management, electronic payments dashboard for their treasury management area. And so you want to be able to attract and retain business clients, and you don't want to inconvenience them, particularly if they're low risk. So for all of these reasons, and then the statistic here, 70 to 80% of review time, what we found from our existing client base, is over limit review time is spent on clients that are low risk, meaning that they have virtually 0% chance of submitting any unauthorized activity in the near to midterm.
But James,
So
if I
that's
may interrupt you
misallocated
there,
time.
like, what's the consequence of this? Like, what's the consequence for the institution when the team spends most of its day on those lower risk exceptions?
Well, sure. Well, one of the main consequences is that first, the exception has caused inconvenience to a low risk customer, right? Secondly, in terms of the time allocated, I'm pretty sure everyone on this call would agree that time, if it's truly a low risk customer, could be spent somewhere else, whether it's on another initiative or spending more time reviewing high risk customers. A lot of high risk customers today do not get reviewed, aren't like the focus of these risk management reviews. And so better allocating time to either other more strategic initiatives or better allocating that time to the higher risk clients in the portfolio. So that's a consequence. It's wasted time, it's wasted effort, and it inhibits revenue growth because good clients will attrite at a higher rate. And for a financial institution that becomes known for treating its low risk clients well in terms of limit management, proactive limit management, it will really increase the growth rate it can just by itself increase the growth rate of the bank by bringing more of those clients in.
And why do you think this does happen?
So the reason that it happens, our view is that there's generally a static legacy approach, a very conservative, and I would say conservative and uniform approach to managing limits. This is what we've seen. Our clients have come to us. There's a particular case study that Scott's going to talk through in this deck. But there are numerous examples. They've come to us and said we really want to renovate or evolve the way that we manage our limits because it's the same for everybody. And this is probably the main reason, there really isn't a good data-driven way to assess risk, which is where our risk grade comes into play. And we really don't have a way to proactively identify how limits should be changed based on utilization, which is another consequence of not having really good command and access to your own historical transaction data. So these are the reasons of why this ends up being a little bit of a dead end and a little bit of a frustration for financial institutions today.
So it's not just about being too conservative, but more like being conservative in the wrong way.
That's right. I think it's conservative in a way that actually hurts growth. In the long run, it's counterproductive. And this is part of the argument for making the change. You think having the same approach, rigorous approach to everybody is a very conservative way to go in a financial institution. But if you're spending your time on people who are low risk in any event, then you're by definition not able to allocate that time to higher risk clients. So is that really a better approach to risk management? Is that really conservative in terms of erring on the side of lower risk? No, it's not.
So essentially, the limit breach is telling us that something exceeded the number, but it's not necessarily telling us whether that something deserves our immediate attention.
Yes, I would argue that for low risk clients, that number, the limit should have been higher in the first place, or at least it should have been more aligned with their actual utilization. A lot of financial institution clients come in and grow and start to bump up against these limits that may have been set, when they initiated a relationship with the bank. And these low risk clients, they get frustrated with that situation. That's not conservative. That's not looking out for the financial institution in any way.
Yeah, and I guess that's what gets us the strange outcome here, the 70 to 80%. And the team is working hard, but the work can end up being directed toward the clients that create the most exceptions rather than the clients that create the most risk. So we identified the problem here. A lot of effort can end up focused on the wrong clients. Scott, let's talk about how we can get how we got here in the first place. Like when you look at institutions, ACH limit management processes today, what do you typically see?
Yeah, it's what we're seeing here on the screen. And I'm sure Amy sees a lot of the same, and it's kind of the things that James was just pointing out, right? It's set once, usually at onboarding. A customer will come in, or a member of a credit union will come in. They'll give us projections about what they think their activity is going to be, what they anticipate that they're going to need, and it makes perfect sense. So we set a limit based off of those values. But they're not always aligned with the actual activity that's occurring, but we don't know that maybe until next year's review. A whole year has passed, we've given them a limit, and that limit isn't really aligned with their activity. We do see it most often is tracked in an Excel spreadsheet. I'm sure everyone has one, right? Where everyone's reviews and limits are all written down. We do see a lot of one size fits all defaults. I'll talk more about that in a bit, but typically we say, yeah, we look at this value and then we add this much padding, and that's what everybody gets. And then, as we've been pointing out, it tends to be a bit conservative by habit, and understandably, right? We don't want to put the financial institution in a risky place. We don't want to like overextend credit to everybody. We don't want to create issues. We are going to err on that side. We also don't necessarily want to have a ton of stoppages so that we're hurting our operations team and their ability to release the files. There's always this struggle, this push and pull there between that and maybe treasury services. But generally speaking, like this is what we see in the marketplace. Set once, maybe reviewed once a year, tracked somewhere on a spreadsheet with a general one size fits all type approach.
So it sounds like the customer's actual behavior changes over time, but the limit doesn't change. How much would you say this is a technology problem?
Very, very little of it's a technology problem. It's mostly just being able to get access to the data, right? It's not that whoever's saying this, either treasury sales or operations or some combination, it's not a lack of desire or willingness to do this. It's a struggle to say like, hey, I've got to get this from my core. I need to get this from online banking, and I need to bring all these disparate information sources together in one place, organize it, and that one place is usually Excel, right? Bring it all together, organize it, and do the manual effort. It takes time at a lot, especially as your financial institution grows in size. If you have 10 originators, this is probably manageable in Excel. But as you're growing, you have 100, you have 1,000, you have 5,000 originators, right? It's very difficult to go gather all this information, compile it, and time consuming to work out those limit numbers and what they should be and compare them to what they have now.
And you mentioned it earlier, it should happen quite frequently. So it's a dynamic risk problem, I guess. But managing a dynamic risk problem kind of complex with like not just ACH, maybe additional payment rails as well, and then pushing all of this data into some static spreadsheet process.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay. Amy, when you hear Scott describe that, a limit established at onboarding, perhaps kept in a spreadsheet and then revisited only occasionally at best, does that by itself tell you whether an institution is meeting the intent of the rules?
I mean, I would say that, no, I don't think it's truly meeting the intent of the rules. I think that it happens because of I believe earlier you used the term, certain things get inherited, right? So somebody comes into a new job, they're handed a checklist, this is what you need to do, or, the financial institution looks at their software and says, oh, I got to enter these exposure limits and or they've got a one pager talking about how to be an ODFI, and it's not giving them the background. So in their mind, it's checking a box, right? It's when the auditor comes in or the regulator comes in, they want to be able to answer the question, do you have exposure limits? Yes. But then oftentimes they're not able to defend how they're set. Are they right sized? Are they, how does the limit compare to, as Scott was mentioning, what the actual not only forward volume, but return volume is, and what the risk profile of that organization is.
Hmm. Would you say, is there anything like inherently wrong with being like conservative when setting an exposure limit from a Nacha perspective?
From a Nacha perspective, I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with it from a rules perspective. I would kind of echo what James mentioned before, which is, sort of is it taking away from the focus of the higher risk where it needs to be? If it is starting to become an impediment to that organization's origination, then we can start getting into some confliction with our guidelines. Yeah.
Hmm. So it sounds like not having a limit is definitely what Nacha doesn't want to. And if the limit is too low, you might be Nacha compliant, but then you might hurt your customer experience, which also isn't good either. So definitely make sure that the limit is not just set once and then left there and wrong over time, but right sized over time to make sure that both Nacha is happy and you're happy because your customers can bring good business into the bank or credit union.
Can I make a quick point, Marcus? There's this
Of course.
concept that I think is important in risk management of adverse selection. So what happens if you're conservative and it does it's credit and debit limits and credit card and lending and in treasury services, whatever. If you're overly conservative and you don't take good enough care of your good customers, they underutilize. They don't utilize to their potential. Good mean in this case meaning low risk, right? Low risk of unauthorized. They may leave the bank. They might attrition may result. Their utilization will be low, and then if you look at the overall ratio of bad activity to good activity, you're actually driving that higher because they're relatively risky. Those with higher unauthorized rates, for whatever reason, even if you're priced for it and it's under control, that rate of badness is going to be higher than it would otherwise be if you're appropriately treating the low risk customers. That concept is called, adverse selection, and you're driving that if you're not aggressively courting your low risk customers and making sure that they're making, full use of their capability with you.
Thanks for this addition. So yeah, it's definitely about like not just conservative limits, but like those well managed limits. Let's maybe go a little bit more into detail on what Nacha requires. I know it's a Nacha co-hosted webinar. Amy, let's talk about what is actually required and not just what customers have historically done.
Yes. So when you actually dig into the rules themselves, you'll see that they lend themselves to the concept that we are discussing today. Because number one, you first have to make sure when you onboard a client that you're confident that they can comply with the rules. So you should have that confidence with any customer that you're bringing on. Then the next step is to it literally says you have to assess the nature of the activity and the risks that that activity may present. So there are the risks that it may present to the customer themselves, the risks that their activity can present to the network as a whole, all participants, and the risks that it can present to the ODFI. And as you all have been mentioning so far, when you're thinking about the risk to the ODFI, you want to make sure you're thinking about that in the totality of your relationship with that customer as well. And as you know, I've been doing a lot of talking about risk management lately because of our new risk management rules. Risk is not static at all. Risks are constantly changing, whether those are, environmental, different types of frauds, different types of schemes, or just simply everyday things like new products and services that customers are adding, new clientele that they're working with, etc. And so right there, that tells you this is an ongoing process. Before you even get into, then you have to establish and implement these limits. You have to periodically review. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And it you have to monitor for multiple things. There's fraud monitoring, but there's also for the risk, the financial risk, over multiple days, not just the forward activity, but also the returns. And that should be driving your limit decisions. You need to enforce any, restrictions, and so that's, right there, those are the verbiage of the actual rules. What you see here on the slide is from our guidelines, which provides some, more real world practical advice. So when it comes to the idea of periodically reviewing, I'm going to go back to the first statement, which is based on the risks that the customer presents. And so those risks are constantly going to be changing at a different cadence based upon the client themselves. So it's good to have a good relationship with the customer so that you're communicating when things are changing. And if you notice, if you don't hear from the customer and you start noticing some things are happening with different volumes in the files, reach out to the customer and say, hey, has something changed on your end? Let's reassess. And so that is not necessarily an annual activity. It may be for, some very low volume originators, that, or some that just have a very simple program. But for others, there are a lot of different catalysts that can, drive this type of revisit of the schedule. And so it's important to have that kind of understanding of your clients. And, this is another thing we've been talking about lately. And this really is, it just fits all together, that this really does mean that you have to understand and treat each client appropriately. And that's again what the rules say. So again, as I mentioned before, you don't want to be slowing the activity. If it starts to become an issue, then like I said, you are going to start to run afoul of our guidance. Maybe not the rule language specifically, but that's not the intention. The intention is that through your understanding of the customer's activity and risk, that it's not going to impede their origination capabilities.
If you notice it in the first place, I guess. Not always that easy to find those kind of patterns in some static Excel tool. We sometimes hear from customers, and it's quite an interesting, I guess, misunderstanding, but please keep me honest there, that customers that do require like pre-funding, FIs that require their customers to pre-fund, they don't really need limits. What do you think about this statement?
I have to disagree with that. They are similar but slightly different. Pre-funding can help offset some of that credit risk, but exposure limits are not just around credit risk, right? They deal with systemic risk. If you're just say, well, I've pre-funded, so it doesn't really matter. Something can go wrong with account takeovers or being hacked into, et cetera, and all of a sudden an account is emptied out, and an exposure limit would have prevented that. So they are not the same thing.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying, and thanks for the input here about the Nacha rules. So if I put the last two slides together, I think the message is fairly simple. The challenge isn't merely setting an exposure limit. You need to know whether the limit still reflects the activity you're seeing. You need to be able to measure against it operationally. You need the process when it's exceeded, and you need to revisit it as conditions change and not just once a year. And ideally, you want to accomplish all of that without creating unnecessary friction in normal ACH processing. and a bad customer experience, which raises the obvious question, what happens if you actually take that philosophy and apply it to a real portfolio, Scott? Let's look at one.
Yeah, so we did a case study. We've actually done a number of these now, and we're seeing a lot of commonality between them, but obviously we'll focus on this one today. It's about a $30 billion bank located in the Southeast. I really like that they're just a good fit for this type of discussion we're having. They have a little under 5,000 originators, but they span multiple industries. They're not like say all payroll or all one type of biller. They have a nice mix. Some of them are groups, some of them are individual, some of them maybe originate once or twice a month, some of them every day. So it's a really good mix of businesses submitting transactions. At the time we did the case study, they had about $6.8 billion in daily exposure. So like if every originator originated to their limit maximum on a same single day, and of course that's never going to happen, but that's just how we measure it. So almost 7 billion in exposure. Over a 6-month period, which is the time frame we looked at, it was around 250 originators were being reviewed. Only 8% of those, though, were high risk. So if an account was stopped once, or if that business account was stopped once every single day, right, we counted it once. So that's what that number represents. The number of ACH originators who had at least one stoppage over this 6-month period. And those accounted for about 1,800 overall stoppages, which is about 10 per day. I was talking with someone just yesterday who kind of confirmed they're in the exact same boat. So I know that's not unusual. Obviously, it's going to depend on how you're running your limit program. But for this particular one, they had about 10 overages a day. So what we did was say, this is baseline. This is what it looked like when they ran their program before we switched to a data-driven approach. And I want to make it really clear, they had a logical limit program in place before we started this, right? So they weren't just throwing things against the wall to see what would stick. They had a process they followed. That process made sense, but they partnered with us and they said, it's not necessarily data-driven. So if we were to look at our customers' actual usage and base the limits off of that, how would things change? So that was the baseline for this case study. It wasn't like we don't do limits today, we need help. It's we do limits, we think we're good at it, but how do we move from good to great? How can we leverage our data to get better at this?
And it sounded like the limits were static back then, and we moved from static limits to behavior-driven and like risk-driven limits.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain the limits were reviewed as part of that annual review process, right? Just like we were talking about before.
Yeah.
All right. So how we actually calculated the limits during this case study and the other ones we've done since then. There's 3 primary inputs that go into our limit model. We look at ACH history, and we chose to do 180 days. Now, this is always a trade-off. 180 days was right in this case. I would argue it's probably the right time frame for a lot of cases, but I'm not telling you like that's the only time frame that'll work. 180 days for an originator who only does maybe payroll like twice a month, that's only going to be 12 submissions, right? For an originator who originates every day, it's going to be around 120 submissions once we take out weekends and holidays. So it seems like a good time frame. Now, I know there'd be those who are going to argue like, oh, but you're going to miss maybe some seasonal activity, right? Like, because this originator's volume, it spikes every December because they have a lot of holiday sales. The reason I'd argue against maybe always using that full year is, do you really want to set your originator's limit based off of what's going to happen 1 month out of the year and be wrong or off overextended in the other 11 months? So to that point, we chose 180 days. And we did it by company ID. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things if you're doing it by company ID or by however you're managing your relationships. That's just how we chose to do it for the use case. The second element was the risk grade, right? So we do a traditional traffic light model, red, yellow, green, high, medium, and low. But it's really important that you're using a risk grade to make risk-based decisions. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but that's the second input is the amount of risk that that individual originator, their company ID, is introducing to the network overall. And then the last one input is a buffer. So not everyone, as you're going to see, gets the same amount of padding added to their limit. Higher risk get less padding, lower risk get more. These three inputs together produce a daily debit and a daily credit limit. That could be a 3-day credit limit. That could be a 30-day limit. It just really depends on how you group your data. But again, for our use case today, I just want to be super clear. We did it at a daily level.
Let's talk about this buffer in a bit more detail. Like, how should this buffer change depending on the level of risk?
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide and let's talk about that, Marcus. For our use case, you'll see that bottom row there, the low risk, we gave them a 50% padding. So we said, well, okay, for this originator, let's look at their max day and let's throw out any, outrageously high days. So kind of pull things into what's normal and then add 50% padding to that. And then for medium, let's follow that same practice, but let's only add 25% padding. Now for our high risk in the study here, we didn't go with their highest single day, we went with their average daily amount. And then we added 2.5 times that amount. So that would still be less than what you did for their max day. The numbers you'll see as the risk goes up, the amount of padding we give them goes down. So I wouldn't focus necessarily on the exact number because you need to tune it based off your risk tolerances, your risk appetite. For this use case, these were the right numbers, but you want to tune them into where you want to be. But ideally, right, we want to be treating our low risk customers better than our medium, better than our high, as far as additional risk limits. This is an area that I see today a lot at many institutions where I say it's like the one size fits all, everyone's getting the same amount of padding. And I think what we're really trying to stress here is this is the model that we think everyone needs to be adopting. Lower risk gets more leniency than the higher risk.
Scott, can I talk a little bit about the risk grade now, or do you want to save that for later?
No, let's talk a little bit about how we risk these customers, because I think that's also going to play into that point that Amy made about considering not just your origination, but your return data, because our risk model takes that into account.
Yeah, you mentioned that the risk grade we simplified operationally because we want it to be useful into a traffic light, red, yellow, green, a high, medium, and low risk. But I want to emphasize that there is, there's actually a pretty significant amount of empirical sophistication or analytics that underlie the development of this model. I mean, it is a statistically derived and empirically valid scoring tool, very similar to, I think of it, I explain it to people as a FICO score you might get from the Bureau. So we have the benefit of seeing over, I think now it's about $1.5 trillion in ACH payments across, I think it's about 600,000 originators across our financial institution or client base. And we store all of those transactions and we see the outcome of those transactions. We see which ones are good and which ones are bad, if they're returned, why they're returned, and we're able to identify the unauthorized transactions. And we summarize that data into attributes for each originator, much like if you go to the credit bureau and you ask for attributes for an individual. Like an example would be the number of times you've been 30 days past due in the last 6 months. It's a variable that's called a summary attribute. In the bureau, you can get 200 or 300 of those summary attributes for any customer that you want. It's different from the trade lines you get from them. This is really a sort of a data-driven view. We've done the same thing with ACH payment data, and we've summarized these attributes into how originators utilize a system, and most importantly, we're able to model or predict based on these patterns that we see, and we analyze through our regression analysis which originators are most likely to have unauthorized transactions in the next 30 to 60 days. those are the ones that, and we create a score through this, and then we translate that score into red, yellow, green, just to simplify it operationally. But it is a sophisticated scoring model. We have a documentation guide. All of our clients that use it have to run it through their model review committee, and we help with all that, of course. But it's not something that a client could typically build themselves. Might not have the statistical talent to do that in-house, and they don't have the data coverage that we have to do that. So we're able to make use of this network effect of all this data that we see to build a very powerful scoring tool. And I guess I would summarize the power of it to say it varies a little bit from client to client, but what we typically see is we score the portfolio of originators every month based on their actual activity over the last few months, or the score changes. I would ask you to think, if you lent some money to somebody when they had an 800 FICO score, and then you see a few months later that FICO score has gone to 600, would you do anything about that? Would you feel like that risk profile has changed? Just as to Amy's point earlier, risk is not static. We're able to A, quantify it, and B, track this over time as an originator's actual transactions take shape. We typically can identify 1%. We'll identify 1% of a bank's portfolio of originators as being high risk, and that 1% ends up being responsible for about 98% of all of the unauthorized activity over the next 30 to 60 days. So that's ex post. We validate that for our clients, and we show them how effective it is over time. So that's how we're able to group the high risk originators into a very small proportion. And it's really that key component, which we've had available for a few years now, that we're now tying in with the actual utilization data for those clients to come up with, or to develop these recommended debit and credit limits.
Perfect. Thank you, James, for explaining. And we've done a full webinar on this topic once. So if you're interested, let us know, and we can send you the recording. Looking at the time, we have 18 minutes left. We will be talking about the results, which I think is the most exciting part of this case study. But before we show you what happened when we applied this across the portfolio, I want to pause and turn the question over to you with one more poll question, because institutions can come at limit management with very different priorities. Like, if you modernize limit management, which outcome would matter most to your institution? Is it reclaiming analyst review time, letting good clients grow without unnecessary friction, having something you can clearly defend in an audit, or reducing exposure on the riskier end of the portfolio? Go ahead and make your selection, please, and then we'll compare your priorities with what actually happened in the portfolio we just walked through. Let's give everyone like 5 more seconds. And then back over to Scott, who can walk us through the results.
Pretty even split. Looks like reducing exposure on the risky end of the book and reclaiming analyst times are the top ones, but really close to exam audit defensibility and letting those good clients grow, very, very close seconds. So I think then these results are really going to speak to everybody, because I think you're going to like what I have to show you.
Sounds like everyone has slightly different priorities, but I'm sure seeing what happened to this one customer is exciting for everyone.
So the first is this graph over here on the left I want to show you, right? So before the risk-based model, right, they were doing about 8% high review, 70% medium, 22% low. So 1 out of every 5 accounts being reviewed was a low risk account. After the model is applied, 72% are high risk. The low risk is actually around 3%, so low that the number doesn't fit on the graph anymore. So as far as an account basis, the majority of our time is now spent reviewing high risk accounts, just by switching our allocation, right? Based off of that tiered model we just looked at. Now, as far as batches go, right, because an account was stopped once, that account could be stopped multiple times, like we discussed in the beginning. That still happens. Overall, we kept about the same number of stoppages, because the goal of the exercise wasn't to reduce the overall stoppages, but reallocate our time. It did go down slightly. But the big shift you'll see there, right? Before 42% were high risk batches, now 85% are high risk batches. Only 3% were low risk batches. So a low risk originator still gets stopped to be reviewed, but like when they really break that pattern, when they have a big velocity change, they normally do 10,000. Today they did 50,000. The batch still gets stopped to get reviewed. Right? You don't just let everything go, but the majority of the time has been shifted from low and mostly medium risk to high risk customers. So, or high risk origination accounts. So we're really focusing our attention where it matters the most, where it's gaining us the most benefit.
Thank you, Scott. So review queue got smaller and it got smarter in shifting attention from low and medium risk noise and toward the originals that actually warranted scrutiny.
And at the same time, reduced overall exposure, right? So it came down by 4.6 billion, and most of that's in that medium risk category. Not everybody's exposure limits got reduced. They all got right sized. Some got increased. Some originators, we said they would need additional funding to support their ACH origination activity. But others, right, like they might have been given $1 million at onboarding, but when we looked at their actual activity over a 180-day span, they're only using $250,000. So we can drop that down, add our padding on. They would still never have their file stopped, but reduce $750,000 of exposure on that account to no one's negative effect. So that's the second big takeaway is, we shifted our allocation to the high risk customers, and we were able to reduce our overall exposure by $4.6 billion.
But earlier we said it's like a different priorities, right? On the one side, conflicting goals. On the one side, customer happiness. You want to reduce the exposure like you did here, 4.64 billion, a lot, impressive. But what happened to the customer experience?
Yeah, it wasn't any worse because, as we said, like you were stopping fewer customers and those customers before who were low risk, and many of them, just on that medium tier, are now able to go through without the stoppages because we've right-sized limits. So it's less friction. It's less reaching out to that customer to make sure, or less going to internally going up the chain to get approvals for files that were safe to begin with. So, and then when we did have to ask, to have a limit stoppage to do an additional review, to get an additional approval, it was for a high risk account. So it could very much justify why we're asking someone to look at this account a second time before releasing it. And as you saw, like as we went through this process to kind of speak to the poll results, this is very defensible, right? This isn't just based off your gut feeling. And what I think you'll find is a lot of the time your gut feeling is going to align with these results anyways. You're going to see like, oh yeah, I always kind of knew they were high risk. I always knew they needed extra reviews. So you're going to have that defensibility. It's based off their actual data. It's based off their risk rating. You can see the whole process end to end. There's no AI black box magic in any of this. It's resulting in less risk, less exposure, and a better customer experience.
So Scott, you would say that we're reducing overall exposure and at the same time reallocating limits to low risk, higher growth clients.
Yes, and it's not just this case study. As I said, I've done about 5 or 6 of these. This is the largest one I did, but across all of them, this is the common trend that we're seeing, that this is occurring at all the financial institutions as we adjust to a database model.
And I want to say, I would be remiss if I didn't make the point that we focus in this webinar on this study and just the concept, and the other clients that we've done this exercise with to help them validate it. But this is actually a module in our system. It's a configurable module. Once we get the data in, when we bring on a new client, we're able to produce these auto limits as well as the risk grades and combine it into this suggestion, and then offer the configuration opportunities. You can tweak the buffers, to get to a better level of comfort. But if you want to, but this is all available in our system.
Let's talk about how this works, Scott.
Yeah, so these are just kind of the pillars. So as you're looking at this, whether you're looking at enhancing your existing programs, looking at partnering with someone like Affirmative to help with these are the elements we would tell you to focus on, right? You want it to be explainable, like I just said. You want to be able to say, this is where the numbers come from, and here's how we arrived at there. You do want it to be configurable. You don't want that one size fits all, right? And you don't want to, if you're purchasing a solution, you don't want one that's just going to tell you like, well, these are what your limits are. You want that input to say like, this is how we need it set up. It needs to be grounded in data. It needs to be behavioral based. It needs to be based off that individual business's risk and what they're bringing to the relationship. Something I didn't point out, but I want to make very, very clear, the decision should stay with you. In ours, we do a limit recommendation model. We say, this is what we're telling you they need to originate ACH. That doesn't mean you rubber stamp and approve everything. They still need to be creditworthy to have that limit that you're giving them. So you need to be asking the question, not like, what's the number, but does the number make sense? Is that appropriate for that relationship? And then obviously you want the whole thing to be documented end to end so that during that audit trail, during your review, you can say like, here's how we arrived at these figures. Here's what we set. Here's who approved it.
Show that it was not just a gut feeling, but that it was based on some methodology and some data. We have one more final poll before we open it up for questions, and we would like to understand like where this topic sits on all of your roadmap. Is this something you are looking at now? Is this something in the next 6 to 12 months or further out than that? Or do you currently have no plans to change your current approach? Please go ahead and make your selection, and then we'll wrap it up and move into questions.
Marcus, one thing I would like to add while folks are answering this poll is, as we mentioned, the thing about pre-funding is one aspect. You have exposure limits. Risk management is multifaceted. So exposure limits, there's also fraud monitoring. By doing this kind of work and monitoring the data that we've been talking about, it helps with all of those other facets as well. Number one, it provides you with additional data for you to, like I mentioned before, better understand your customer's activity. But another phrase that's been mentioned several times is the focus of attention. If you're not worried about this, then you can start to put more focus on your transaction monitoring and looking at different types of details that help you to identify when something abnormal is happening with your customer versus just continually bumping up against limits. It helps you get to that deeper, more effective level in your full risk mitigation approach.
Definitely more effective and more efficient. And I guess goes back to the discussion we had earlier about like how much noise and how much signal, like are you reviewing those that actually matter, or are you just like randomly reviewing it? Interesting results, 34% looking at it now and another 32%. So 2/3 of our participants are looking at this topic within the next 12 months. Very interesting. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this poll. And this gets us to our last slide, which is asking you all for questions. We have 7 minutes left. I don't see them here.
It looks like we have two.
Okay.
So we have one from Mordecai from earlier, and they said, can we dynamically monitor transactions, and transactions that do not match past usage will require confirmation from the customer to release? So technically, we are dynamically monitoring the limits.
I'll let Amy answer, but I think that's probably, it's good to be dynamically looking at customer activity behaviors, changes from behaviors, velocity changes. I would just warn that you don't only want to do it at a single item level because of aggregate risk, right? So we've seen this before where let's say a bank has a single transaction limit of $5,000, just as an example, but somehow our fraudster figures that out and submits multiple transactions under that dollar limit. So each individual item is clearing the limit. But in aggregate, if we were to go back and look over the day, right, and they submit 100 of those, we're like, oh, it's $490,000 in debits that they've been able to, or credits, to slip into the system. So it might not have broken the pattern for that single item, but in aggregate it did.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Scott.
Thank you. And I see a second question about return on invest and how this all pays off. Maybe James, you want to talk? You get 2 minutes about how the business case typically works for our customers.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we have a champion that wants to bring us into the financial institution, that will help understand the gauntlet that needs to be run. Obviously, all the data security reviews. There's obviously a business case review, and we help our clients, prepare that. And as sort of what goes into that ROI calculation to get approval and make the investment, whether it's with Affirmative or some other capability. Typically, it would be the savings in time allocation. That's very important. Being able to manage ongoing compliance expense. What would that cost be without a tool like this? One of the things we started to add into those ROI calculations for our clients is how much do you anticipate either increasing your growth rate by becoming more competitive as an FI with the capability to dynamically set and manage limits based on risk? What is that worth to the financial institution, and what is it worth in terms of a reduction in attrition? So it really is case specific, and we walk through with our clients sort of what their situation is and help them put together a very valid, bank specific business case in support of building momentum around making an investment in this type of capability or similar capability.
Thank you, James. This was all the questions we had so far. Over to Elizabeth, which I think has a very sweet offer for our more than 100 participants that stayed with us for like the full hour.
It's true. It's true. Well, first off, I just want to thank you guys all for joining today. We really appreciate you guys spending this hour with us and going over everything. Amy, thank you so much for your input. Scott, James, Marcus, thank you guys too for speaking. I thought it was a great presentation. I did want to say, if you guys are trying to see how this looks at your financial institution, if you guys book today, you also get cookies. And I know you might be thinking, but Elizabeth, that sounds too good to be true. A data-driven solution and cookies. But it's all true. It's all very true. So go ahead and scan that first QR code if you'd like to talk to us about what this looks like at your institution. Furthermore, if you'd like to read the case study that we presented today, that second QR code on the right is the full written version. If you just want to read through it again and see how it works. But I think other than that, seriously, we appreciate you guys joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and looking forward to speaking to a lot of you in a discovery call soon. Thank you.